everyone, and welcome back to Polina's Pages. Today we're talking about The Importance of Being Earnest, which is one of my favorite plays of all time. So I'm very excited to get into this video, and that's also such a good book pick because it's actually on the Edexcel A level curriculum. Without further ado, let's get started. A brief note about the symbols and the themes and the characters before we start. So some of the symbols are town and country, which represent the trivial nature, the tradition. They're the settings used to support themes of deception. There's alter ego because Jack wears funeral clothes and they represent extravagance and duplicity. The tea service represents grave manners under false guise. Food represents overindulgence and excess. There is also Orphans and Christenings, Cecily's love letters, the 3-volume novel, and the handbag, and the army list. Some of the themes covered are marriage, class, social expectations, gender roles, deception, fact versus fiction, and identity. One final thing to mention before we dive into the summary and analysis is that names are very significant throughout the play. So of course The Importance of Being Earnest is a play on words because earnest as in the name and earnest as in sincere and honest. And here both Gwendolyn and Cecily, they really want to date and marry someone who is named Ernest. And both Algernon and Jack are very willing to christen themselves and to change their names, even though names is how others perceive them. Names are something that they've been used to throughout their entire life. They have an appearance that's suitable or rather unsuitable to their names. So this act of christening is a very important change, symbolizing that they're willing to change their identity because of what their wives want. Algernon's flat in Half Moon Street. The room is luxuriously furnished and artistically decorated, showing Algernon's taste and also Algernon's wealth. He wants to seem like a man of taste, so rather than having the minimal suite that was typical of bachelors at the time, because it was said that bachelor's suite needed a woman's touch, so a woman was needed to decorate the sparse furnishings even though they had a lot of wealth. Algernon is the opposite. He puts out his wealth for all that are present to witness, essentially. Lane is setting the table, again contrasting the difference between the upper class and the working class. It's not seen as the gentleman's thing to do to set the table. There are far higher occupations for Algernon to get onto, such as playing the piano. Algernon finishes playing the piano and he walks in. He makes a dramatic entrance. He wants all attention in the room to be on him. Algernon asks Lane if Lane has heard Algernon playing the piano. He seeks validation even from the servants, and Lane replies that, "No sir, I did not think it was polite to listen." Algernon replies to that is a shame because although he does not play with accuracy, he plays with wonderful expression, he plays with sentiment, he has great forte. What Lane says is quite a funny comment because of course how could he not listen? But the strange thing is that servants exert a lot of power even though ultimately their social standing is less, because they live around these upper class people their entire lives. They almost feel like members of the family but not quite. There's a degree of privacy and also not quite privacy because they're familiar with the most private habits of the nobility. They know when to bring tea, they know when somebody is having trouble, they know when somebody has secret guests over, they know everything. But at the same time, even though they're there and they go unnoticed pretty much, they do have that strange influence. For example, when Lane walks into Gwendolyn and Cecily's argument later, they even stop arguing. Ultimately, Miss Prism is the key to the whole resolution of the play. So, a note about plays at the time. So, Wilde riffed off of the idea of the classic Victorian structure where there would be orphans and poor women, and then there would be some kind of conflict and deception, and at the end everything is happy and sunny and ends with marriage. So Wilde very much riffed off of that concept, but to the extent that he actually made irony, that he criticized the upper classes and the behaviors of society at the time. And Miss Prism is ultimately the key because she, like in the plays, she presents a solution at the very end when it seems that everything has gone wrong. Another note about Lane and servants, just a final note on the servants and the juxtaposition between upper and lower classes. Lane would actually be at the top of his field. He's a manservant, a so-called butler. His position holds a certain level of prestige, so he would probably be quite offended to be lumped in with the lower classes because he has certain morals and certain attitudes, and although they're not quite as stiff and as rigid as those of the upper class, they are still something to be followed religiously, so Lane is considered to be top. And so I think the implication here is that there is collaboration needed between the upper levels of society and the lower levels of society in Victorian times, because ultimately it is the servants who actually provide the solution and the servants who manage to exert power and influence. But back to the topic of Algernon and his playing for fancy and for pleasure and art for art's sake, as I've discussed before. It's a little pretentious, but then just as quickly, Wilde switches sides and moves on to a humorous note about cucumbers. These tone shifts are very frequent throughout the entire play. There's a moment of philosophical musing here, there's a moment of satire here. I think part of the reason that the play remains so relevant and so interesting is because of those tone shifts. You don't ever get bored of just one thing because the play has so much to offer and so many layers to it. So onto the note of humor. Of course it's clear that it was Algernon and his guests who drank all the champagne, but Lane plays along with the joke. He says, yes, of course the servants drank the champagne, all 8 bottles and a pint. There is an underlying knowledge of truth, but there is again some level of deception. As I've mentioned, deception and trickery is a key theme throughout, and it is seen even in the interactions here. Because of course they both know that Algernon is the one who did it, but Lane takes on the blame, and even though they both know, they don't explicitly say it. Indeed, they refuse to acknowledge it. It's a private joke between them, but it also shows that there is a certain level of servants always taking the blame, of the lower classes always being the one to bear the brunt of the consequences. But just when we think that there is some semblance of amicality, that they're somewhat on level ground, Algernon tells Lane that actually, I'm not that interested in your life, man. Like, I don't want to be involved in your family life. It seems to me a little bit boring. And Lane simply agrees. He's used to his master changing tones and changing moods, much like in the play. When he leaves, Algernon remarks, if the lower orders don't set us a good example, what on earth is the use of them? They seem as a class to have absolutely no sense of moral responsibility. Enter Ernest Worthing, announces Lane, and at this point the audience would be quite confused because then we have Jack. So who's Jack, they're thinking, right? Jack says pleasure brings him into town. What else should bring one anywhere? Again, a commentary on seeking pleasure and the lax attitude of the upper class, and perhaps also representative of the aestheticism movement. Critics have discussed for a while just how much of Wilde is in The Importance of Being Earnest, because of course, because of the idea of the dandy and the way that Algernon and Jack act, they're very effeminate, so they don't quite suit the masculine ideals of Victorian society, much like Wilde himself didn't. There is a comparison to town and city life here. When one is in town, one amuses oneself. When one is in the country, one amuses other people. It is excessively boring. Both the town and the city provide a means of escape. For Algernon, he escapes to the country. For Jack, he escapes to the city. Both are romanticized in the play, showing that no matter the differences, ultimately some are good for some are good for others. The important thing is that they provide a means of escape, and every place has its good and bad, and escape is what everyone seems to seek. Jack sees the cucumber sandwiches that Lane has laid out for Lady Bracknell, and he asks Algernon what those are for. Algernon then informs him that Aunt Augusta and Gwendolen are coming. Jack then informs that actually, I'm here because I want to marry Gwendolen. That's not pleasure, that's business, claims Algernon. So marriage at the time was a very serious affair. That's one of the key themes discussed here. It's very much an economic deal. So for Algernon to say this puts that fact into the open. It was an unspoken fact, but Wilde very much reveals that here. Algernon also says that proposals are unromantic. They take the unpredictability out of the marriage, and if he was married, he would quite like to forget the fact that he was married. Again, his fleeting nature. So we can already see that Algernon is established as quite a lax man. He doesn't really care about what other people think. He does things purely for his own amusement. He always seeks entertainment and unpredictability. He doesn't want to be stuck in the rigid monotony of life. Jack attempts to eat a sandwich, but Algernon stops him. They're for my aunt, only to eat one himself. He says he ordered bread for Gwendolen so Jack can go ahead and eat that, and when Jack bites into the bread, Algernon remarks that he has quite an appetite, almost as if he was married already. He then uses the comment to lead to the topic of infidelity, Jack's supposed infidelity, and presents to him the case of the cigarettes. Notice how Algernon and Jack, even when bantering about the cigarette case, they're always poking fun at each other. Their relationship is almost sibling-like because they make fun of each other. And that banter, that sense of competition, it was very typical for men at the time, that kind of relationship when they poke fun at each other, when they treat each other almost like siblings. But that sense of competition is not quite a joke because they're vying for the attention of women that they want to marry. Again, marriage is important. Both Algernon and Jack can take onto the role of being earnest even though they are very different people. And so we see that it's not quite so simple as just a name than at first glance, because of course we see that names are so important throughout the entire play, but here, no, because they're very different characters, they're very different personalities, and they behave very differently, but yet they both seem to be earnest to different people, showing that perhaps actually beauty is in the eye of the beholder and it's your gaze that assigns your meaning onto other people. I'd also like to highlight that underneath all the jokes and all the, oh, she's my tall Aunt Cecily or whatever, there is some underlying truth. There is some very relevant information to us the readers. It's our first time reading the play, so we see all this that, oh, so Jack is an orphan, oh, so Jack was adopted. We see all these important bits under all the facades, and I think there's a message here that, can you really know someone if all you do is have these surface level talks? In the scene, we also see Jack lie quite a lot, even though technically he's the morally correct one. So let's take a closer look at some of the lies that Jack tells. First, he lies about living in Shropshire and about having horrid neighbors, and then Algernon confronts him about Cecily because he's protective of Gwendolen, his cousin, and he asks Jack why he has a cigarette case that is Cecily's gift, when Jack said previously he didn't know anyone named Cecily. Jack then proceeds to lie that Cecily is his aunt, a charming old lady living in Tunbridge Wells. Tunbridge Wells is actually quite a fancy place. It's very much the British version of, oh, I have a girlfriend in Canada. It's a perfect place to make up a fake wealthy aunt. Algernon slowly reads out even more from the cigarette case, and Jack lies that he uses Ernest in the city and Jack in the country. Algernon also says in the scene that the truth is rarely pure and never simple. Modern life would be very tedious if it were either, and modern literature a complete impossibility. So again, it highlights the importance of trickery as a tool to make life more interesting, and in the same way uses questionable behavior as a means of entertainment, very much in line with what the aestheticism movement believed, so the fin de siècle. Algernon explains to Jack about his Bunbury and how he uses him as an excuse to get away from Aunt Augusta because she wants him to sit next to a married woman when they have dinner, and the married woman constantly flirts with her husband and he thinks that it's frankly disgusting. But just a few pages ago he said that women never flirt with their husbands, with their future husbands. So again, he changes his mind in the blink of an eye. He changes his mind when it suits him. He changes his words when it further highlights his position. So he wants to appear as both this knowledgeable man and woman, and also as someone who doesn't really care, who has this, oh well, what's the point of it all attitude. He also advises Jack to keep Ernest alive when he gets married as a means to have an affair. Very unethical proposal, but ultimately Algernon does kill Bunbury because of Cecily's influence. Enter Lady Bracknell and Gwendolen. She asks Algernon why there are no cucumber sandwiches, and Algernon says that, Lane, why are there no cucumber sandwiches? Again, this play, even though he perfectly knows that he ate the cucumber sandwiches, and Lane once again plays along. He conceals his master's true doings, true actions. It was very important for servants to be able to keep secrets, and he says that, oh, he went to the market but there were just no cucumbers so we couldn't make the sandwiches, and they even weren't willing to accept ready money. And this is a slight dig at Algernon because he never really pays his credits. He spends more than he should spend, and we also see that later on when he rips up the bills. Algernon and Aunt Augusta, as he calls Lady, then begin to discuss the topic of the dinner, and Algernon uses Bunbury as an excuse, as he told Jack that he would. He says, well, sorry, my friend Bunbury is very sick, and Lady Bracknell is very upset. She comments that he should just make up his mind and either live or die. Again, ironic because it's not such a simple decision, whereas Algernon's decision of trick or not trick is far more simple. He could just choose not to deceive. Algernon then goes off to show Lady Bracknell the music, showing that he is actually a good friend in many regards because he allows Jack to have that moment alone with Gwendolen, because they don't really have those moments alone. Gwendolen is unmarried, so she would be very much in control of her parents. The Lady Bracknell would make sure that she's not getting up to like heathen-like things with other men, so they are usually together all the time. And in this scene we see Gwendolyn's character quite a lot. She says, "Don't talk about the weather, it means something else." And when Jack confirms he wants to say something else, she says, "I thought so. In fact, I am never wrong." She comes off as quite sassy, quite confident. She prompts Jack to just say it, and when he says that he likes her, she says, "Yes, I am quite well aware of the fact." Gwendolyn is shown to be this very proper Victorian woman, and yet she's perfectly aware that marriage is an economic position as well. We live, as I hope you know, Mr. Worthing, in an age of ideals. The fact is constantly mentioned in the more expensive monthly magazines and has reached the provincial pulpits, I am told, and my ideal has always been to love someone of the name of Ernest. There is something in a name that inspires absolute confidence. She also says that she knew she was destined to love Ernest, but if he wasn't Ernest, she wouldn't love him so much. In fact, she says there's very little music in the name Jack. It does not thrill, it produces absolutely no vibration. Jack mutters that he must get christened and change his name at once, but to her he says, "Let's get married." Gwendolyn says, "Sure, but you haven't asked me to marry you yet." And Jack asks for permission, and she says, "And to spare you any possible disappointment, Mr. Worthing, I think it only fair to tell you quite frankly beforehand that I am fully determined to accept you." I think it's also interesting to point out that the women in this play are quite powerful. They hold quite prominent positions. They are ultimately the ones very much in control of what happens. Actually, everything hinges on them, even though by law they don't really have rights. Lady Bracknell comes in just to witness Jack on one knee and tells him to get up at once, like, "What are you doing in this undignified position?" And she tells Gwendolyn off. An engagement should come on a young girl as a surprise, pleasant or unpleasant as the case may be. It is hardly a matter that she could be allowed to arrange for herself. She then tells her to leave and begins to interview Jack. She says, "Well, this is my daughter, so I am the one who gets to be in control. Like, you have to pass my criteria. She is the overseer of this." And although she mentions her husband, it is very clear that she is the boss. He is just a minor role. And Lady Bracknell is portrayed as somewhat of the villain figure because she is like the obstacle to happiness. But I think it's wrong to talk about her like that because ultimately she just wants the best for her daughter. I think part of the reason is because we don't really know that she was of high social standing before. Rather, if she became a lady, it's because she married a lord. So perhaps she had a much lower position than before. So for her, perhaps she knows what it's like to have society look down on you, and Gwendolyn would very much marry down if she married Jack. And so I think Lady Bracknell is just very protective of her daughter since she knows that, well, you can't just divorce, there's no other chance, marriage is important, and she wants her daughter to make the correct choice. What follows next is sort of like a work interview, so let's take a closer look at some of the questions that Lady Bracknell asks Jack. She asks him of his occupation, and she's happy that Jack smokes. She thinks that men should have an occupation rather than be idle. She asks him how old he is, and he says he's 29, to which she replies that it's a good age to be married at. She asks him if he knows nothing or everything, and he says nothing. To which he says, "I do not approve of anything that tampers with natural ignorance. Ignorance is like a delicate exotic fruit. Touch it and the bloom is gone." The whole theory of modern education is radically unsound. Fortunately, in England, at any rate, education produces no effect whatsoever. Another dig at society, that ultimately people learn to read and write rather than think critically why society is the way it is. If it was otherwise, it would prove a serious danger to the upper classes. She also interrogates him about property. He has a country house too, which the lady is pleased with. She also says, "You have a townhouse, I hope?" A girl with a simple, unspoiled nature like Gwendolyn could hardly be expected to reside in the country. We of course see the irony, but again, notice the difference between country and town from the point of view of the characters. This was a prominent topic back then, so this makes sense. Everything seems to be going well. Jack has class, Jack has money, he has character, his politics are satisfactory to the wishes of Lady, but then it gets to the topic of lineage. And to lose one parent, Mr. Worthing, may be regarded as misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness. because Jack has no parents. And then it is revealed to us that Jack was found in a black leather handbag with handles to it, an ordinary handbag in fact, abandoned in a cloakroom at the Victoria railway station. Lady advises Jack to quickly find some parents, and she leaves angrily, and Algernon walks in. Jack calls her a gorgon because for him the lady is like a mythical creature he wants to kill. He wants to conquer the demon in order to be with the lady, the fairy tale narrative promoted in novels. After this interview, Algernon walks in and asks Jack how it went, and Algernon is of course familiar with his aunt's character, to which Jack replies, "You don't think there's a chance of Gwendolyn becoming like her mother in about 150 years? And Algernon answers with, "All women become like their mothers. That is their tragedy. No man does. That's his." So it would be interesting to compare Gwendolyn to her mother in an essay. So here are some points that both are controlling, they care about marriage, but they're also quite different in that they have different ideas on what the ideal is. Again, that generational gap of people believing different things. Algernon asks if Jack will tell Gwendolyn that he has two identities, to which Jack replies, "My dear fellow, the truth isn't quite the sort of thing one tells to a nice, sweet, refined girl. What extraordinary ideas you have about the way to behave to a woman." And Algernon's vulgar reply, "The only way to behave to a woman is to make love to her if she is pretty, and to someone else if she is plain." All deception and trickery is exposed at the end, even though they are nice, sweet, refined girls, or close to it, and everything ends up being fine. So I think here it's well as common that these relationships aren't healthy, that it's not okay for men to hide information from their women just to seek pleasure for themselves, and the same for women, like this cheating, this deception. It's not something for entertainment, it's something that ultimately hurts your partner. Algernon's replies are frankly scandalous. They would have elicited some perhaps tentative laughter, but again, definitely not something to say in public, and I think we should use this chance to take a closer look at Algernon's character as well. So Algernon is very interesting because he's witty, he's meant to be a funny character, but he's also terribly dishonest. He definitely doesn't fit in with the Victorian ideals of the time of this honest guy, and he seems to be the protagonist much more than Jack, even though they're both at the center of the play. And Jack is more so at the center of the play. He has a more interesting background. He's somewhat of a dandy, they're both somewhat of a dandy, and I think there's a comment here that you can be interesting even coming from a boring traditional background on Wilde's part. Jack decides to kill off Ernest very easily in the next scene with no regard whatsoever. He thinks it's the better option because he just wants to be honest with Gwendolyn from here on. And Algernon expresses concern for Cecily because of course Jack told Cecily all about Ernest, but Jack dismisses it saying, "Oh, Cecily, she's a very proper lady, she goes on walks, she pays no attention to her classes, she doesn't have this overly romanticized idea." Again, of course, ironic if you can tell that of course she clearly does have these romantic ideas, like if she goes on walks and she daydreams and she doesn't pay attention in lessons. He also describes her as very young and pretty, and so now love blossoms in Algernon's head too, and Jack remarks that Cecily and Gwendolyn are perfectly certain to be extremely great friends. "I'll bet you anything you like, half an hour after they met, they will be calling each other sisters." And Algernon replies that that is only true if they have insulted each other first, and he turns out to be right, as we will see later on. The two then discuss where to go after dinner. Not to a theater, Jack says he loathes listening. Not to a club, he hates talking. Not to the Empire, he hates looking at things, and instead they shall do nothing. Algernon remarks that it's awfully hard work doing nothing. However, I don't mind hard work where there is no definite object of any kind. Again, very indicative of his character. It's like, oh no, my life is so hard because I do nothing, but then there are people working 10-hour shifts and children working 10-hour shifts, but never mind that, my life is hard. Gwendolyn comes in after this and says that she will always love Jack no matter what, and desperate times call for desperate measures, and so she gets Jack's address. Says all this with Algernon present in the room, even though she tells him, "Oh, just stop listening." Again, this kind of like belief that, oh, if you just stop listening, you won't hear anything. And Algernon, smiling, writes down the address on his cufflink because he's of course planning to go see Cecily. And Jack and Gwendolyn leave, and Algernon is left alone, remarking he'll be going Bunburying. Lane presents him with bills. Algernon simply tears them up, and then Jack comes back and remarks that your friend Bunbury will get you into serious scrape someday. I love scrapes. They are the only thing that are never serious. "But Archie, you never talk anything but nonsense." And Algernon finished the scene with, "Nobody ever does." And so we clearly see what sort of things and what sort of deceptions will begin to take place in Act 2. So Act 2 video coming soon. I hope you enjoyed this one, and see you soon then.